Good morning, travel industry, and everybody who's listening. This morning, where Airbnb is going to do its IPO, arguably the biggest IPO the travel industry has ever seen, I wanted to give my thoughts on what this day and what Airbnb has meant professionally to Skift, to the company that I and the whole of Skift team has built over the last 8.5 years, and what is meant to me personally as well. It's a company that we've followed very, very closely since the start of Skift for all the reasons you can imagine. It was an emerging company. We were new. We sort of saw parallels in what was happening with the company and its influence in the industry and the larger world to our growth and our influence in the travel sector as well. So it's a very interesting and a mixed emotions day for me as well. And I think everybody at Skift who's covered it, including my co-founder, Jason, who really was the first journalist to start asking the hard questions in any type of media, really, on what is Airbnb's effect on cities. We used, since we were based in New York when we started, and we obviously had our headquarters in New York until COVID hit, we took New York as the mirror to the larger issues that Airbnb and short-term rentals had on cities, and the good, bad, and ugly cases. In fact, the first story that Jason did a few months into Skift launching, I think it was probably just over a year since we launched, that we did a giant deep dive on the good, bad, and ugly cases of Airbnb in New York City. And that had such a big impact. It was a big data dive on what percent of listings were illegal according to New York law. And that had such a giant impact that everybody from New York Post to Times to Journal, others covered it. And then we also followed up a few months later with an actual formal deep dive. We worked with a data company to mine all the Airbnb listings in New York and did tons of charts on superhosts versus what actually weren't called superhosts back then, but multiple listings under a single person. So created a huge impact. The company was not used to being asked the hard questions. The tech press, the startup press was very fawning. The mainstream press didn't know how to put their arms around it. For them, it was, oh my God, this company that is helping people make money through their homes, or strangers staying in other people's houses. They couldn't have the nuances of the coverage, and so we were the first ones that really started asking the hard questions. The company did not like it. It was a young Silicon Valley brash company. The PR there was early in its own journey of understanding who this company Skift was, and in many ways, Brian, the CEO and founder, Brian Chesky, and the co-founders and the PR people hated us for a long time. I think we heard through different sources close to them that they thought that we were out to get them, that we had an agenda, which we didn't. We were a journalism-focused company covering the business of travel and Airbnb as the exemplar of what the future of travel could be. So somebody had to ask the hard questions, and it was us. So it took a long time for us to build sort of an official editorial relationship with them. It was only when Chip Conley was hired as the head of hospitality, they brought in what they called Chip, which was a modern elder, to give wise counsel to the young founders, that we started building an editorial relationship with Airbnb, and Chip was quite responsible for that because he'd been reading Skift for a long time before that as well, or at least from the start. And over the years, we've built a relationship. We've also built a business, commercial relationship with Airbnb. They've spent money with us on advertising, but we've obviously never let up on our spotlight, good and critical, on the company. We're very, very appreciative of its sense of design, of what it brought to the world in terms of branding. One of the, I think, the smartest things that it did was to never position itself as a travel startup, which in many ways is the kiss of death for a lot of early stage travel startups, because they get trapped in that insular circle of travel startup world and travel tech and the VCs that are all the same VCs that give the same advice and same type of growth strategies, etc. It always stayed on the outside, build a larger global super brand, as the former CMO of Airbnb, Jonathan Mildenhall, who was responsible early on for bringing that big company super brand ethos to Airbnb. He used to call it that we want to make Airbnb the super brand, which obviously it is now in so many ways an iconic verb that any of the other competitors or previous vacation rental companies have not been able to do. So it's an iconic company. It has changed how people travel. It has changed how people used to view what used to be called sharing economy. Now, obviously, it's not that. It's short-term rentals, and it's no longer the alternative hospitality. It is mainstream hospitality. It's made a lot of people's lives, both from a host perspective as well as from a guest perspective, a lot richer in dollars as well as in terms of experiences. Obviously, tons of issues that have emerged with Airbnb, all of them legitimate: regulation, taxes, its effects in cities, particularly in dense areas where the rents have risen as a result of people renting apartments and putting them on Airbnb. That's a real issue. The push and pull has happened. We've covered every bit and piece of it over the last 8-9 years of our existence. The company has matured a lot. It's given up some of its early brash disrupt at any cost mentality. It could have easily been Uber, but it wasn't. It could have easily been WeWork, but it didn't happen to it. I think the founders, all three of them, were more grounded and soulful, and they hired people like Chip and others that gave them wise counsel. The investors, including Paul Graham from Y Combinator, through which Airbnb first came on as a startup, gave them wise counsel on how to ground themselves and not become that prototypical brash Silicon Valley company. And it's avoided most of the pitfalls, not all of them, but most of the pitfalls along the way as a result of it. So all in all, it will go down as one of the greatest companies, I think, in travel industry, in history, at least so far as it's written. And it well deserves it in many different ways. From a personal perspective, I've stayed at, I think probably must have been close to 100 Airbnbs, maybe more. In my lifetime, I started doing that early. We've traveled since our kid was born, now 6 years old almost, our son. My wife and I, we booked a hotel the first time after he was born, realized I don't know what we're thinking, after he went to sleep at 7 in the evening, and then we had to wheel him into the bathroom for him sleeping before we were able to get room service to have dinner, etc., etc. That was the first and last time we did that on our own. We booked a hotel. Every time since we have traveled, we've booked an Airbnb or equivalent short-term rental. 9 times out of 10 was an Airbnb, and a full house that has enriched our lives as a family. Personally, when I've traveled for business, 9 times out of 10 if I had a choice, I would, for our company trips, etc., I would book an Airbnb. A couple of times in Singapore, 2 or 3 times that I've been for work. The rest of the company may have stayed at hotels. I booked an Airbnb and was richer for it. And I think it opened up, having grown up as an immigrant in India, for me, staying in strangers' houses or different types of housing was not an issue. You sort of roll with the punches. But also you become an expert Airbnb picker in many ways if you use it enough. And I would say that out of 90%, maybe 95% of my Airbnb picks have been good to decent to great. Maybe one or two times, I remember one time in upstate New York, we booked a fall trip from New York, and it was not the best experience. And it was then I realized I was looking at the photos wrong, and obviously the host didn't really disclose that well. There was an instance where there are a couple of instances where I felt that the host, because of us being brown and Muslim, etc., didn't accept our booking, and a bunch of stories came. I tweeted it, and then BuzzFeed and many others did stories based on that in their larger issues of Airbnb and some of the hosts displaying racism in terms of not getting people of color to stay in their houses. So short of that, we've had incredible experiences staying personally, and the ease of use of Airbnb has increased. Obviously, it's become more expensive in the pandemic as well, just because the demand is there so much. So I haven't used it as much in the last just this year. Some of the fees, etc., have I would humbly say have gotten out of hand. But in general, my favorite experience that I had in Airbnb with my wife and son, I think he was 3 years old then, was when we went to Faroe Islands, and we stayed at an Airbnb, this beautiful house where this Faroese couple, husband, wife, their kids were already old enough and left. In fact, they were out of the country at that point. They moved downstairs for us to live upstairs in their beautiful, well-appointed, very kid-friendly, had a crib and all. And the host, the woman, knew that we were going to come around 9 p.m. Local time to the apartment, to the house, which was late enough that most of the restaurants in that town were closed. So she asked us if I can cook something, and I said, if you can cook fish for us. And she cooked fish for us, left it. It was hot. We met her, obviously, when we checked in. She cooked rice for us. And that, we were there for, I think, 2 weeks in Faroe Islands, maybe 10 days. That ended up being our first and best meal that we ate on the islands, even though there's the great seafood there as well. So personally, it's been very enriching for me to use an Airbnb. Every time I go to London, I stay in a particular spot in South Kensington so that I can go have my kebabs at Bosphorus Kebabs. I can go to Lyon and have my coffee and breakfast, and I love South Kensington Station, so I can get anywhere relatively quickly. So to say that this has been a journey of sorts for me personally through these years with Airbnb, and for Skift as a company as well, would be an understatement, and I congratulate obviously the whole company and the founders as well. And we will, as Skift, continue to cover it. Don't expect any leniency from us. I know the PR, we continue to have the push and pull with the PR team as well as executives. We've had challenges getting them to speak at our conferences because many times the PR thinks that we ask the hard questions, but that is our job. We won't be easy tech conference where the founders go and get fawning questions. We will ask the hard questions, but we will ask fair questions. We'll always continue to have fair coverage of the company, and particularly needed in a company that's that iconic and that influential in not just in travel, but in the larger business as well. So those are my relatively brief, not so brief thoughts on Airbnb and its IPO, and what that journey for Airbnb, as well as a parallel journey for us covering it, has meant. All right, looking forward to the next phase. I think this is the first book has closed on the company. And now the next book will be written at some point. Maybe Skift will write the actual physical book on the most definitive book on Airbnb, but more to come on that. Thank you again.